So I'm Kayla. I used to be a special education teacher, and now I teach art workshops full time. So I'm typically teaching at a local art studio to me. We're in Sterling, Virginia, and I teach Turkish mosaic lamps and pressed flower art. So creating different pieces of wall art with pressed flowers. Moss wall art, so it's live moss, and you create a piece of art. And as long as you keep spraying it with water, it'll stay alive. I also do vitriol paintings. It's a type of glass painting that looks like a stained glass, and rug tufting. So you're learning how to use a rug tufting gun on different sized frames, and you make yourself a rug by the end of the class. So most of the classes I teach are anywhere from an hour to 2.5 hours, the longest being about 3 hours for a larger sized rug. But this is a new workshop for me to teach, and it's something that I enjoy doing. So I'm happy to take questions throughout, but it will definitely be helpful to have a little bit of help monitoring those. So hopefully you can see the angle okay here. I'm playing around with a new kind of tripod, so hopefully that works. But if you can't see anything, just let me know. I'm going to go over the things we're going to use during the workshop really quick, and then we'll get into it. And I have a couple trays that are kind of in different stages already, so if we need to jump ahead for time, we can do that too. So the one that we're working on tonight is just a wooden tray with metal handles. I found that for this particular project, anything that has a little bit of a lip to it is easier to work with because it's going to catch that plaster a little bit better. So the first thing you need is just some sort of a tray. And then I've gone ahead and broken the plates already, so you don't have to listen to that because it gets a little bit loud. But we've got a bin of just broken plates we're going to use as our tiles for the mosaic. For me, I just go to the thrift store and find plates that already have chips in them. Sometimes I'll stick to a color scheme, so today it's blue and white, but you could do whatever colors you wanted to, or just miscellaneous plates. So the easiest way to do it is just to put them into 2 Ziploc bags and use a hammer on a hard surface. So something I would definitely do outside or on a workbench versus in your house on nice kitchen floors. But for me, I just take them outside onto concrete and I use a hammer over the plastic bags, and that way it catches any extra shards. So what I have found is that the smaller you make the pieces for the mosaic, the better it is, especially depending on what type of object it is that you're breaking down. So some of the pieces that I have are from bowls, other pieces are from mugs, and so you can see there's still like a piece of a handle to that one. And with something like this, it's easier to break it into a smaller piece so you have a flatter piece to work with versus a mug has a bunch of kind of wonky shapes and curves to it. Plates are definitely the easier things to work with because they have so much surface area to them. So a lot of the smaller pieces are going to be from plates that are kind of broken down a little bit differently. But you can kind of decide what the purpose is of the thing that you're making. If it's a tray and you want it to be fairly smooth, smaller pieces are going to work better. If you're not comfortable breaking down your own plates, even Amazon sells bags of broken tile. And so they'll come in different colors. You can choose the colors. They have different shapes and textures. But those will come in a little bit more rounded pieces as well. So if you were doing this with a smaller person, like a little kid or something, and they wanted to participate, you could use one of those. And they're going to be smoothed out a little bit for you too, versus some of the plates are going to have a little bit of a jagged edge to it. So, and when I was finished breaking down the tiles, I sorted them all into a bin so that I wouldn't have any of the extra little shards, because those can get a little bit sharp sometimes. But once you have your pieces broken out, you can either go ahead and lay out all of your tiles first and then go back and glue them individually with the mosaic glue, or you can just do one clear coat or one coat of the mosaic glue first and then stick them down, which is the method that I prefer, and it makes it go a little bit faster. But some of the other things we're going to be using are going to be a mosaic glue. So this one's just from Hobby Lobby. It goes on white, but it dries clear. And it usually takes anywhere from 15 minutes to about 3 hours to dry clear, depending on how thick of a coat you do. We're going to use a type of grout at the end. This one is just a pre-mixed grout, so you don't have to do any mixing to it. And it usually comes in either a white or a black, so totally up to you on the color. I like to use some sort of a container of water. That way you can dip your sponge in there and get it moist before you start using the grout on the tile because you want to kind of rinse it off to make sure you don't have any extra pieces of porcelain or any of the extra glue on there. And then something to spread the grout. So you could use something like this. You could buy it at the hardware store, or they sell grout shredders specifically for mosaic, and it'll have a couple of different edges to it. So that's always an option. I like to keep something like baby wipes off to the side or a wet paper towel too, because parts of this can get kind of sticky. And then your mosaic glue is going to come with a nozzle to it. So you can either unscrew this, or I find for a larger surface, it's easier to just go straight from the bottle. That way you can get a little bit better coverage with it. And you can either start with the whole surface, or you can work in kind of a section at a time as well. And then on here, sometimes it's better to have a paintbrush, so one that you don't really care about. You're not going to want to use this for another craft afterwards because it's going to get glue in the bristles. But you're just going to smooth out some of that glue. And then it's your choice what section you start in. You have a good amount of work time with this type of glue. So anywhere between 15 minutes and so you're just going to spread out the glue, and then you've got about 15 to 30 minutes to get your tiles down before it really starts to dry. And then for the purposes of this, I've already glued another one that is mostly dry to show you what it looks like as it's drying. And I have another one that has some grout on it, so we can go over how to clean the grout, because the grout takes a little bit to dry. There isn't really a method to the madness with the tiles. You just want to kind of lay them out. So you can decide how close together you want them, how far apart. The grout is going to end up going on the inside of the tiles, so it's totally up to you how much space you want to leave. And since it takes a little while to dry, you can always go back, kind of move tiles around at the end if you want to as well. That way, if something isn't right where you want it, you have more time to move it. I usually will do kind of one layer at a time, and then if I decide that I want to go back into an area, once you have the full thing kind of covered in tiles, it's easier to move pieces around and kind of plug in with smaller pieces. Yeah. So you could do it like a puzzle too, where you work around the outside first and then go in and fill in, or you can just kind of go kind of haphazard with it. Not necessarily. I've got a couple here. It'd be easier to show on these that are a little bit different. So you can kind of see the thickness there. Because we're going to use the grout, it's going to fill in any extra area. And if you needed to put extra glue under something to get it to be a little bit more level, you could do that as well. But like this is one that I did earlier. And they're definitely not all level. So you can kind of see from the side a little bit better that they've got a little bit of extra dimension to them. This one is from Home Goods. You can definitely find them at Hobby Lobby, or if you have the time to thrift them, you can do that too. When I was experimenting with this, I like working with the porcelain plates, but porcelain is also a harder clay body, and so it is a little bit harder to break down depending on what it is, like what form you're working with. I haven't, mostly because I don't want to have to sand down the edges of it as much. And if I were doing more like jewelry pieces, I would have to go through and sand it. Um, I used to do a lot of ceramics, and so now I'm much more cautious of like the clay dust and things like that. So for me, I would rather just like break them down and make something new out of them. But not that making the jewelry isn't, just a different kind of technique. I do with the Turkish mosaic lamps. And so with those, rather than using broken pieces of tile, it's clear or stained glass tiles. So the traditional way of doing a Turkish mosaic lamp would be to follow a pattern, and typically it's some sort of a star or a flower. Um, I tend to kind of like to use the tiles more as like tessellation. So I've done some that look like fish bowls, flowers. I've done Starry Night on a lamp. So that kind of a thing. You could do the same thing with this if you had enough different colors. Smaller is definitely going to be better. Um, so even like on this guy, this was part of a bowl, and so you can see there's a little bit of a curve to that one. So the smaller you could get that, you may still have a little bit of variation in thickness, but it'll be easier to kind of plug in the places and get them to a more level area versus this guy was part of a plate, and so it's pretty flat throughout. Um, but anywhere you can get a smaller piece is going to be easier. And the smaller pieces are also nicer because you could break up something like the mug where it still has a handle right here, so this part might not be quite as usable, but this piece, if you got it down a little bit smaller, would still be very workable. It just depends on each of the sections. So some of them are going to be a little bit bigger than others. Try to go less than a centimeter on any of them, but if you like the way that the grout looks better, you could do that too. The bigger your gout, the more grout you're going to end up using to fill, so that's kind of something to keep in mind as you're going. Depends on the type of grout that you use. So mine is a pre-mixed grout that's made for mosaic. This one's called Red Devil, which is a pretty common one for mosaic. And so this one should not crack. That said, if you leave it outside and it's freezing cold and water gets in there, it might crack over time, but that's also just kind of the wear and tear of the piece. When you're first applying it, though, it really shouldn't crack. So some of them I know have a little bit more of a curve, and since it's going to be a tray, I want parts of the middle of it to be a little bit flatter versus like you're probably not using the outside of the tray for something like a drink later on. So it doesn't really matter to me if this piece has a little bit more of a lip. But I also know depending on where I am kind of in the bucket of tiles, I have different textures and different colors of plates. And so I'm also sort of spreading out where each pattern is instead of having one like this guy and this guy in the same place. They're the same colors, but I like the way they look a little bit more spread out. And then some of them are smaller and like they'll fit into a better area in a little bit of a different way. And so at this point, the whole tray is pretty much covered, but you could go back and kind of move pieces around and fit other pieces in. Now you could use the same one. So when I do mosaic at the studio, I'm using glass tiles rather than ceramic tiles. It's the same glue. Some of them go on clear and dry clear, others go on white and dry clear, so you could do it either way. If you wanted to, you could even do something like a vase with mosaic. It's something that I teach at the studio a lot, where you would just work in about a 2 to 3 inch section at a time with the glue, depending on the size of your tiles, because a vase has so many different curves to it. That you want to make sure things are a little bit more set versus a tray. Doesn't really matter because it's all going to be on a flat surface. But in that case, you would just put on the glue. It would go on white, so you'll see a little bit of white from the back of it. Add your tiles on, and then since it dries clear, you would be able to see through that glass. So you can even do a stained glass, like sun catcher kind of a thing, without having to use the lead in between. So at this point, I'm pretty happy with where I have everything. So we're gonna set this one to the side, and then I'm gonna show you how to do the grout on one that I've already had drying for a little bit. So I would typically let it dry for about 3 hours before I add the grout. So it could be a project for a rainy day where you want to be inside for a little bit. But so the glue is pretty wet and white on this one. On this one, I've got a couple spots that are still a little bit damp, but they're hard enough that we can go ahead and do the grout. Let's see how we can do it. So for the grout, you're just gonna work with that spatula I was showing earlier. Hopefully you all can see this well enough. But we're just gonna work in kind of a section at a time. Typically you wanna go in either vertical or horizontal areas with it. So this is already pre-mixed. That's kind of the consistency that you want. If you're using a grout that you need to mix yourself, you want to just make sure you get all of the fine little particles combined. That way it doesn't try to crack on you later on, because that difference in the water and the texture of the grout would be what would make it crack. And then you're just going to add it on pretty thick, and your goal is to go through all of those little cracks. If you get extra on the tray later on, you're just going to take a wet sponge and go over that. You can always wipe down the tiles beforehand if you want to. Doesn't necessarily make the grout stick any better, but if it had been sitting for a couple days and dust had gotten on it, that would be a good thing to do. And with the plate, since there's so many different kind of levels to it, you really just want to make sure you get in all of the cracks and crevices first. And the ones you go through there, then you can scrape off with it. Okay, and then once you have the grout on, you're gonna let it sit for about 15 minutes, and then you'll come back to it later. So right now we look pretty messy, but it looks like this. And then after about 15 minutes, and you've scraped it, you have something that looks a little bit more like this. You're gonna grab a sponge and a bucket of water, and you're just gonna make the sponge damp. You don't want it to be super wet. And you're just gonna go over the top of it to kind of clean off those tiles. And this isn't necessarily something that's going to happen all at once. You'll want to go back probably the next day. Just let it dry in between as well. And so now at this point, you should have something that looks like this. So all of our grout is nice and level. We've gotten rid of all of the grout that's on top of the tiles. You have a little bit of milky looking water on the top, but that's where you'll go in the next day and you'll just wipe that off once everything is dried and solidified, and then the whole thing is done. Yeah, you can just take the cloth to it. And so if you have it in an area where, like, on this one, it's pretty thick over in this section, you can just keep rubbing that area down with the damp sponge, and that'll clean it up over time. And if it starts to get too kind of like liquidy, if you have too much of that milky white stuff happening, just clean out the water and keep going back with clean water, and that should be enough to clean it down. Most of it came from Goodwill. Um, and so when I'm typically looking for like the plates that are like 99 cents or on sale or whatever it is. But a lot of the times I'll also see like a bowl or a mug or something that has a chip in it. And most people aren't going to purchase that, and it's just going to go to a landfill. So my thought process more, like, I could give it a second life if I turn it into something like this. It may not be for its intended purpose, but it's fun and it can be a little cathartic to break the glass too. I wouldn't do this in the freezing cold. Some of the mosaic glue will say like use it at a certain temperature range. So definitely something I would do inside. Depending on the glue you're working with, it will probably say to work in a well ventilated area. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. I wouldn't leave the grout out uncovered if you plan to reuse it, just so it doesn't harden on you. But other than that, I think that's about it.